Hello everybody and welcome to the 8th video in our series of videos on the Middle Ages. As always, we begin with our learning outcomes. So by the end of this presentation, you guys should know 3 medieval monastic orders and how you would become a monk. You guys should know what life would be like in an abbey and some of the buildings within this abbey. And finally, you guys should know the 3 differences between Romanesque and Gothic churches. In our last video, we looked at the structure of the Christian church and some of the big controversies in the church. There was so much history around the church that we didn't even get to the time of the anti-pope. But today we'll be looking at what life was like for those at the bottom of the church hierarchy, specifically the monks. Now, we've already looked at some aspects of monastic life in our study of early Christian Ireland, but monastic life really developed and hit its stride in the Middle Ages. Now, monasticism, which is the practice of renouncing worldly pursuits and devoting oneself to the spiritual work, became more and more popular among men and women in the Middle Ages. The man who first set up the template for what rules a monastic community should follow was a man called Saint Benedict from Umbria in Italy in the 6th century. Whether they were early hermit communities like Skellig Michael or more worldly monasteries like in Glendalough, they followed the rules of Saint Benedict, and these monks were known as the Benedictines. New orders began to develop, like the Cistercians, but the most popular were the Dominicans, who were founded by St. Dominic in 1216 in France. These monks focused on teaching and education within the wider community. And another popular monastic order were the Franciscans, who were founded by St. Francis of Assisi in 1209. And the Franciscans had very strict rules around abstinence and poverty and things like that. Most monks and nuns lived in abbeys, which were kind of large monasteries or nunneries. These monasteries or nunneries on a much larger scale. To become a nun or a monk, you would join as a novice. If the abbot or the abbess, whoever was the head of the monastery or nunnery, was pleased with the novice, they could become a monk or a nun once they'd passed this novice stage. They would have to take 3 vows: a vow of poverty, which meant they couldn't give up all their possessions; a vow of chastity, which meant they wouldn't have kids or marry; and finally, a law of obedience, which said that they would follow or obey the abbot or abbess's orders. Prayer was central to their lives. A typical day would include praying in the church up to 6 times a day. They would have, including a mass at 3 a.m. called the Matins, an evening prayer called Vespers at 6 p.m. and the final prayer of the day would have been at 8 p.m. called the Compline Mass. Now, most monasteries were self-sufficient, which meant that they could feed themselves and acted as the center of their community. A Middle Ages monastery was different from a early Christian one. The main buildings were the church, which we can see here, which was generally the largest local church. They would have slept in rooms called dormitories, which would have been located around here in the abbey. They also had an infirmary for treating the sick. They had an almonry where they would give out charity to the poor. They had a chapter house where they held their meetings for the running of the monastery, and had a cloisters, which was a covered walkway for prayer and thought. They also would have had a scriptorium, which we've met before, which would have been used for copying manuscripts. So these would have been the 6 main buildings within the abbey: the dormitory, the infirmary, the almonry, the chapter house, the cloisters, and the scriptorium. Around this time, also a new type of travelling monk became popular, which was known as a friar, and he would go from town to town and village to village, spreading the word of God. One of the last things to mention was the development of church architecture at this time. We've seen some of the castles of the Middle Ages, but probably the most impressive buildings of this time were the cathedrals. In every diocese, the bishop built a cathedral. Originally, these cathedrals were in a style called Romanesque. They had rounded arches such as this. They had thick walls, which we can see on the inside of this church here, with very few windows, and they had these pillars inside the church that supported the roof. But later developments led to a new style coming in known as the Gothic style. This, of course, is part of the famous Notre Dame Cathedral. And here they had these pointed arches over the doors and the windows. They had slender walls which could hold in a lot of glass and have these stained glass windows. This particular circular window is known as a rose window. To support the church with its thinner walls and slender columns or pillars inside, they use these things called flying buttresses, which we can see here. And they also had spires that seemed to reach all the way up to heaven. They would also have gargoyles to remind the churchgoers and the people about the horrors of hell. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. So you guys should now know 3 medieval monastic orders and how you would become a monk or a nun. You guys should know what life would be like in an abbey and some of the buildings within it. And finally, you guys should know the 3 differences between Romanesque and Gothic churches. Thanks for watching. Hope you guys got something good from this video.